Welcome to the Library of Congress's National Book Festival. My name is Moira Shourie, and I'm the Executive Director of Zócalo Public Square. The theme of this year's festival is American ingenuity, and the authors we are speaking with today have used ingenious ways of examining societies in crisis and the journey of democracy. James Robinson is a political scientist and economist and the director of the Pearson Institute at the University of Chicago. His new book, co-authored with Daron Acemoglu, is The Narrow Corridor: States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. Jared Diamond is a professor of geography at UCLA, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and he has been awarded the National Science Medal. His latest book is titled Upheaval: Turning Points for Nations in Crisis. Today's conversation is titled How Liberty Flourishes. Speaking of American ingenuity, upheaval, and the fate of liberty, we are at a crossroads of all these factors right now. I am a new American citizen. I was sworn in 2017. I left one democratic framework, the largest democracy in the world, India, and inserted myself into the most powerful democracy in the world, the United States of America. Jared, your book examines moments of upheaval in democracies. How do you define a national crisis?
I define a national crisis by analogy with a personal crisis, the crises that all of us experience with the breakdown of relationships and deaths and loved ones. Personal crisis is a situation where we realize that the way we've been functioning no longer works. And by analogy, a national crisis is a situation in which a nation realizes that a basic way that it's been functioning no longer works. An example being Finland had a certain foreign policy towards the Soviet Union. And on November 30, 1939, Finland was invaded by the Soviet Union, making clear that Finland's previous policy was not working. That was a crisis that exploded. There are also national crises that unfold more gradually, such as the breakdown of Australia's White Australia policy.
And James, moving to your book, I'd like to set up the framework of our discussion by asking you to define what is the narrow corridor, and how do societies enter this corridor, and how are they washed ashore or exit, and how do they remain inside? So, what is the narrow corridor that you're talking about?
Well, the book is really about sort of trying to explain long-run dynamics of political and economic change in society, and it hinges around a sort of the balance of power between the state and society. So you can think of sort of three archetypes of a situation where the state dominates society. You could think of China, or you could think of society dominates the state. That might be a place like Yemen, and in the middle there's a balance between state and society, and that's where this corridor is. So we emphasize a lot this balance between state and society, but it's that you don't just stay there. Why do we emphasize this narrow corridor where there's a balance? Because that creates a very specific type of dynamics, and it's those dynamics that create liberty in that's the main argument in the book. How do you get into the narrow corridor? Well, that's a very deeply historical thing. It can be engineered. You could think of the United States in the late 18th century as a moment where the founding fathers tried to kind of engineer a particular balance between state and society. But even that came in the context of a history that was, say, distinct from Latin America. So the emphasis in the book is very much on the long run dynamics. Think about my Chinese example, or think of the example I gave of Yemen. We know quite a lot about Yemen going back 1,000 years, and so that these are very persistent outcomes, and so that's a sort of consoling fact. I think historical fact when we're so concerned about falling out of the corridor today. How do you get into it? You have to create this balance, and I think there's many different ways that's happened historically. How do you get out of it? Well, you get unbalanced. The state takes over or society takes over.
Right. And there are maybe places in the world that we thought were very safely in the corridor, but now are at risk of falling out of it. And one big reason is, of course, the global pandemic and COVID-19. And James, is COVID-19 a stress test for liberty and democracy? And how are various governments, authoritarians and democracies, how are they responding to this virus?
Well, I think if you think about the United States, there was already a stress test going on. There's been huge upsurge of challenges, balance between state and society. I think actually Professor Diamond's book is very penetrating on this, where he turns his gaze on the challenges to U.S. institutions. And using my own terminology, I'd say that's precisely undermining the balance of state and society. People are worried that technology is making the government too strong, too powerful. There's enormous distrust and cynicism about political institutions. We're at an all-time low in trust in state institutions in the United States. So there was already, the balance was already tottering, and now we've been hit by this crisis, which it seems to have exacerbated many of those conflicts. It's exacerbated inequality. It's exacerbated this disequilibrium between, what we need the state to do and what people will trust the state to do. I think other parts of the world obviously are doing much better. Places, where I'd say the society dominates the state, like Yemen, they have very little capacity to kind of cope with this. They have very poor public health systems. They have massive underprovision of public goods. That's going to be a humanitarian crisis. Places like China, they have this despotic power to kind of lock everybody down and control everybody. But that comes at a price in many other dimensions, as we know. But in some sense, the places which are doing best, places like South Korea, places like Taiwan, places like New Zealand, are places where they're in the corridor. There's immense trust in the institutions, and there's a healthy balance. I think the problem in the United States has been the forces of globalization and inequality and political polarization of the sort that Professor Diamond talks about in his book have sort of made it very difficult to get to that solution that, say, South Korea and Taiwan has achieved, or New Zealand.
And wouldn't you say that, this virus seems to be re-entering our societies in different waves? And just when Taiwan and South Korea and Japan seem to have had it under control, maybe the less than ideal examples set by maybe some of the people in other countries who've just wanted to travel and have their summertime fun is causing a resurgence. So there are some bad habits that are leaking out into societies that were very safely in that corridor and responding to COVID-19 in a way that you would expect governments to function that are in that corridor, wouldn't you say, James?
Yeah, it's a global problem. I mean, yes, it's a global problem. New Zealand can solve the problem in New Zealand, but it can't solve the problem in the rest of the world. And we were all connected. And I think, that's both a challenge, but it's also a source of optimism, because so many of the problems we face are global, with climate change and global warming. We need global institutions for dealing with that. So I would say that one of the really optimistic ways of thinking about this is it'll just make it so evident how we need more global cooperation and institutions to deal with the challenges that the planet faces.
And Jared, I'd like to bring you in here because we've been talking a little bit about the concept of a natural experiment, and what do you see is a natural experiment? How do you think about it, and how are institutions of democracy faring when we're all undergoing this simultaneous natural experiment?
I'd like to say two things about that, Moira. One is that my background is not as a geographer or historian, but I was trained as a physiologist, specifically as a gallbladder physiologist, as a specialist for that small organ nestled against the liver. And for 40 years, I taught medical students. Well, as a gallbladder physiologist, the way that I learned about how the world functions was not the way Jim does now and I do by comparing different countries, but I manipulated gallbladders. I dipped them in solutions with potassium or without potassium. Those are manipulative experiments, and they're very effective ways of reaching unequivocal conclusions because you know what the change was. But when I switched over to geography, I could no longer manipulate countries. I could get unequivocal answers to the state of democracy in the United States if I were to draw a line down the Mississippi River, and then every state east of the line I commanded would have a Republican government. Every state west of the line would have a Democratic government. And then the tier of states along bordering Canada would have dictatorships. But we can't do that. Instead, Jim and I have to deal with what's thrown at us. But there's a lot of variation thrown at us. And an example, following up on Jim's point about the different ways that countries have dealt well with COVID. As Jim pointed out, some of the countries that have dealt well include countries like New Zealand and South Korea, democracies. But a country that has done extremely well is Vietnam, which is not a democracy at all. I believe that Vietnam has had 0 deaths. Why has Vietnam dealt well? Well, there are reasons. Vietnam got shocked by the predecessor of COVID, namely the 2002 SARS epidemic, which again broke out in wild animal markets, just as did COVID. And lots of people got killed in Vietnam. So in Vietnam, when they heard that there was another disease emerging from the wild animal markets in China, there was an instant reaction. In Vietnam, with its strong government, it's not the case that if you contract COVID, you are quarantined in your house. Instead, you're taken out of your house, you're put into another facility, and your companions in your house are then put on lockdown, and there's tracing. Well, Vietnam, as a strong government, is very good at tracing. The result is that in this very undemocratic way, Vietnam has arrived at an effective solution. This then illustrates COVID is a vicious natural experiment. It's a perturbation, like me dipping my gallbladders in potassium solutions. Lots of gallbladders got dipped in potassium, but in this case, lots of countries got exposed to COVID. And Brazil has reacted one way. Within the United States, Florida has reacted one way, and Massachusetts another way. So we have a massive natural experiment.
And so much of the reaction and the response also has to do with the compliance of citizens. And what has that revealed about how citizens respond to instruments of government and maintaining some semblance of national health? What does that reveal to you, Jared?
A great natural experiment again, and I see the different ways that it plays out from the different countries in which I've lived. I was living in Germany on the day that the wall was erected. Germany is the foreign country with which perhaps I'm most closely involved. Germans are disciplined when the government tells them to do something, and nowadays they have a democratic government. By and large, people do it. In the United States has this history of individualism, of not doing what the government wants us to do. And so here in California, while my state of California was the state whose governor reacted perhaps first proactively to the crisis, nevertheless, lots of Californians do not want to be told by the government what to do. And so there are lots of Californians who are out on the beaches now, infecting us further with COVID. So the natural experiment illustrates itself within the United States.
And James, I'd like to ask you, we've been talking about societies in this narrow corridor. Do you think COVID is the crisis, or do you think COVID is revealing deeper problems that existed before, problems of inequality that are being brought to the forefront by COVID? And how do you think societies are reacting?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's doing both. I think it's exacerbating problems of inequality, which were already very challenging. It's somebody like me or Professor Diamond, we can sit at home, we can teach our classes on Zoom, we're not unemployed, we can isolate ourselves from society. This is, high education, well-educated people can do that. Poor people have to go to work, they can't deal with their children, because the schools are closed, they face unemployment risk. So it's exacerbated the nature of inequality, but I also think it's revealed that it's a type of sort of crisis that we haven't really dealt with before, and some types of behavior. So, for example, the type of behavior that Professor Diamond was talking about, that the US, if people in the United States are very kind of individualistic, they're against the government, they're skeptical of government authority. You see that all the time. Here, civil disobedience, people don't want to cooperate with the governor of Illinois proposing to shut this and shut that. And so I think the nature of the world changes. The world changes, society changes, it evolves, new shocks, new crises, new challenges come, and we have to adapt. Humans have to adapt. And I think the story of the corridor is not, you get into the corridor and stay the same. As I was saying, there's lots of dynamics. If I thought about the US society or society in Western Europe, it has these characteristics, but there's a lot of dynamism in people's beliefs and institutions, and I think this shows that, maybe we have to change. We have to change the way we act. We have to change the way we relate to each other. We have to be less individualistic and worry more about the consequences of our behavior for other people, and maybe that will spill over into other domains. So I think both of those things, it makes these problems worse, but also it shows that there are new problems we didn't understand before. We have to adapt to those, and we have to change the way we operate. I think the big picture, I study Latin America a lot, for example. And, if I thought about the evolution of the United States over the last 200 years compared to Latin American countries, which all became independent more or less at the same time, I'd say the way that things were organized in the United States has been quite a success relatively. But success doesn't last. The world changes and we have to adapt.
Right, you have to keep tending to that garden. We've been, there are all of these threats that face humanity, including climate change, the threat of nuclear war. But this crisis, the COVID-19 global crisis, has also revealed a new threat that I don't think many countries had an eye on, and that is the inequality of education access. And even within just the United States, we are seeing this play out on such a micro level. In the news, we hear that parents are organizing into education pods and hiring teachers where school districts are remaining closed. But that really is going to lead to a huge inequality of education access. And that's the generation we're hoping is going to solve all these problems that we're handing them. So how do you, as social scientists and people who write about how nations address crises and how they solve problems, Jared, do you see any silver lining to the education inequality as it's revealing itself today, and how COVID might be a way to fix that in a very deep systemic way?
Yes, I do see a silver lining, and I feel like a referee at a football match or a soccer match, which is fast moving, and the referee throws down flags, and then there's a pause, and the referee picks up the flags. All right, there have been several flags thrown down, one that you just threw down about inequality, and 3 or 4 thrown down by Jim, which illustrate why over the last 15 years, Jim has been the colleague who's had the greatest influence on me, because he's wonderful insights and wonderful ways of saying things. Some of the things that Jim pointed out was, this is a global problem. That's the essence of it. It's a type of crisis we haven't dealt with before. That's the essence of it. We have to change. That's the essence of it. So what is new? Yes, this is a global problem, but as you point out, we've had other global problems. We've had the problem of climate change, of unsustainable resource use, the global problem of inequality, the global problem of the risk of nuclear war. But none of these global problems, interestingly, have galvanized us the way that COVID has galvanized us. Why? Yeah. The reason is that COVID kills you quickly within a few days, and if you die of COVID, there's no doubt that you died of COVID. All right, in the worst case scenario, 76 million people may die of COVID. Far more people risk dying of climate change and unsustainable resource use. But when you die of climate change, it's not within 2 days, and you don't say, my mother died of climate change. You say, my mother died in a tsunami or of starvation or of the other consequences of climate change. So climate change has not galvanized us. It hasn't caught our attention. Instead, COVID this relatively minor problem compared to climate change has galvanized us and caught our attention. And therefore, I see a silver lining. I'm cautiously optimistic. If we succeed in solving COVID, because COVID is a global problem, as you say, COVID has to be solved by global action. If New Zealand solves its own COVID problem, New Zealand will just get reinfected by other countries. The whole world has to solve its COVID problem. So for the first time, we have a global problem that catches our attention. Maybe it will get the world to recognize that global problems require global solutions. And having solved COVID in the next year or two, then we'll go on to solve the really important problems of climate change, inequality, and unsustainable resource use. That's why I'm cautiously optimistic.
And what I'm seeing playing out in my children's generation, and this is something that UCLA has brought to the forefront, Jared, your home institution, the grand challenge. And one of the grand challenges of the university is to address depression, which is at, I believe it is at a pandemic level amongst young people and teenagers on a global scale, because they're overwhelmingly terrified about climate change. They feel that there's no solution, that we're not giving them the tools to fix it, that we've hamstrung them. And so this is the generation we're expecting to solve our problems. And James, as you've illustrated earlier, you've talked about how it does come down to the individual, and societies change and evolve. They don't just enter this corridor and sit there counting their blessings. They have to keep evolving. And there's this young generation that already is confronting depression and anxiety, and now they have to be in self-isolation and locked away from their peers. How do you think this generation moves through? Do you think this generation is a generation that will keep most societies in the corridor, or what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, with respect to the theme of education, I think there's been mounting evidence about many dysfunctional aspects of the education system in the United States, the way, the local financing of public schools works, the enormous consequences for people's life chances and welfare that living, in particular neighborhoods, marginalized, under-resourced neighborhoods causes. And I am optimistic, at least, talking about the United States, I am optimistic that you can solve that problem. I think some problems in the United States are very hard to solve just because of the whole kind of ideology and the way people think about the world, the sort of world view that people have in the US. But I think that is a problem that's soluble because it runs counter to the whole narrative of being American, the sort of land of opportunities and upward social mobility and kind of equality of opportunity. And we know that this is fundamentally mined by many of the inequities we see in education and the distribution of resources. So I think you can develop a narrative which can change that. If you look at the stagnation of social mobility and median average wages over the last 30 years, there's mounting evidence on this. And I think that is something that is politically feasible. But many things in the United States are not politically feasible, I think, given the way people think about their societies. And unfortunately, we have a government that's very much, at the moment, a federal government that's very much in the mold of a kind of simplistic idea of what it is to be American: small government, low taxes, no regulation, and that's the worst possible combination with such a challenge. When we need to change and we need to adapt. But Herbert Hoover was the president when the Great Depression hit. In the United States, and he didn't do. It took time to adapt, and it took time for Roosevelt to come, and it took time for people to rethink what the options were and come up with politically feasible alternatives. So I just thinking about education, that does seem to be something to me that one could make a lot of progress on.
So I'd actually like to dig a little deeper on that point. In the narrow corridor, you describe India as a society that's most tied down by this concept, the cage of norms. And I was born and raised in that cage. My mother was sterilized after I was born, the last of 3 girls. And now I'm raising 4 brown sons in America. And America has its own unique and different cage of norms. And I want to know which society's journey and which society that you've examined is the best learning for where we find ourselves in America right now?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I think, different societies have different histories and they have different problems. If you went back 200 years, Colombia or Peru, or, they faced similar types of problems that the United States faced. And they were much less successful at solving those problems or coming up with a set of institutions or a social contract that would deal with those problems. If I thought about India, I mean, I'm not a scholar of India, but what we emphasize in the book is that what's so fascinating about India is it has this enormously deep history of democracy. If you go back to the days of the Buddha, there was participation, there was accountability. There's an enormous history of kind of citizen and popular participation in governance, which is a crucial part of getting into the corridor. But why India has found that so difficult to get into the corridor, we would say, is because it's of the more sort of sociological aspects. That's what you're talking about with this cage of norms. But the caste system, the caste system, is a sort of fundamental impediment to creating an inclusive society or moving into the norm, into this corridor where you get this synergy between the state and society. So I think, we talk about this in many other contexts in the book, in sub-Saharan Africa. In the United States, you have the same thing too. You have the norm that, people who are, poor or people who are unemployed or, they're really to blame for their predicament. There's this sort of norm that, if you work hard, you'll be successful. And so failure is due to your own personal inadequacies, and we know actually that's not true, in terms of economic research, but it's very much the ideology in the United States.
And so maybe what gets us through is, in fact, what the theme of the book festival is, which is American ingenuity. How do you think COVID-19 and how do you think our response to it can make democracy stronger in the United States, but also in parts of the world where people are really fighting for democracy? Do you think COVID-19 has an opportunity, has opened a door to strengthen democracy?
It has an opportunity to make things better, and it has an opportunity to make things worse. We see the tendencies in both directions now. COVID, the essence of COVID is that it's a global problem. As I mentioned, for the first time in human history, we recognize that it's a global problem that demands a global solution. Every country has to solve its COVID problem, because if COVID remains in Zaire and is eliminated everywhere else, the world will get reinfected. So in the worst case, there's already competition. Face masks got sent to Europe, and there was a scramble between France and Russia and Israel and Sweden to buy those face masks. There's concern now that with the efforts to develop a vaccine in China, in the United States, and Britain, that whichever country develops the vaccine first may hoard the vaccine for itself. So the worst case scenario would be increased competition and a bad future for the world. The best case scenario is that people recognize that this is a global problem requiring a global solution. COVID is a powerful teacher. When a few countries have succeeded in dealing with COVID within their own borders, they've gotten reinfected. South Korea, Australia, New Zealand has gotten reinfected. And so COVID is teaching us that this is a global problem requiring a global solution. You asked about whether there's a country that's a model. And as Jim pointed out, every country is different and some countries are really different. So you might think that there's no model, but there are some human universals. One human universal is the Boy Scout motto, be prepared. This is a motto that's vivid for me because working in New Guinea, in the jungles of New Guinea for the last 50 years, I've had to learn to be prepared for anything going wrong. Anything might go wrong, and I've got to be prepared for it. And I carry that attitude towards my life in the United States. It drives my friends crazy. There's a country that has learned that lesson. That's the country of Finland. Finland, because of its experience in World War II, when its paths to the outside got cut off, the Finns realized we have to be prepared for anything. And so I have a friend in Finland who's on the Finnish government commission that meets every month, thinks of everything that could go wrong and prepares for it. One month, the month that I last saw my Finnish friend, they were thinking of what would happen if Finland's electrical net got knocked out. Another month, they think of what happens if the financial net got knocked out. So Finland is prepared for everything. Not surprisingly, because they had stockpiled grain, and they had stockpiled fuel, and they had stockpiled chemicals. Of course, they stockpiled face masks. And Finland, therefore, was prepared for COVID, just like Finland is prepared for everything. So in short, my hopes for the world would be a proactive attitude in the world in general, that we have to be prepared for things going wrong. And then my best hope is that the world will realize that we have to join together in solving world problems, because if we don't join together, we're all ruined.
Thank you, Jared. That was actually very insightful to hear about Finland. And, the topic of today's discussion, as I started out, is actually titled How Liberty Flourishes. And James, I'd like to end with you. Can liberty flourish again? Here we are all, feeling like we're prisoners in our own vortexes, and that if we meet a friend or, take our dog for a walk, we're going to be infecting people. And that really has been crushing our personal sense of liberty. So can liberty flourish again? And what do you think are some of the positives that can come out of this?
Yeah, I think it can. I mean, I think when the pandemic started, when it became evident how serious this was, I think there was a sort of rapid embrace of very draconian type models. The Chinese. China can just sort of lock everything down, and that's exactly what the epidemiologists think is a good idea. And we can't do that; it's too chaotic, and people, and so then there's a. There's a sort of demand, for kind of the state, this controlling state, and that seems like a terrible threat to democracy to me. But I think as the situation has evolved, we've actually seen some of these examples that we've been talking about. South Korea has managed to be just as effective with far fewer economic consequences, by the way. South Korea hasn't had the kind of lockdown that they've imposed in China, and it hasn't had nearly such bad economic consequences. Of course, there have been economic consequences. Its exports have gone down and its markets contract, so I think
global contraction as well.
Of course, yes. You can't isolate yourself from that. Just as Professor Diamond was saying, we can't isolate ourselves from this. So I think it's not the Chinese model doesn't look so great. The very draconian model doesn't look so great. So I'm less worried about that now. I'm just very concerned about So I think yes, liberty can flourish. Liberty can flourish, and we have to use this as an opportunity to see. To reflect on the problems of our society. We haven't talked about the enormous problems of public health care, in this country, the fact that millions of people don't have health insurance. This is an enormous crisis, and if somebody is sick, I can't isolate myself from that, and so that's also maybe it'll help us reflect on the absence of basic public goods, that we all need in this society, of insurance for poor people, and so that's something else that I think could come out of this, because what liberty can you have if you don't have health or access to healthcare? So there's some basic public goods that we need, and I think this also can help us focus on those.
Right, and so I'd like to actually bring our discussion to a close on that hopeful note that we do have countries and forms of government that are responding well to the needs of its citizens. And we've revealed that inequalities in the world, places that face inequality are facing much greater impact, the negative impact of COVID-19. But these are actually revealing great opportunities for us to strengthen our sense of democracy and liberty, both on a national as well as on a personal level. I'd like to thank James Robinson and Jared Diamond for joining us today. This has been a really enlightening conversation. And I've read both of your books. They're fascinating. And to read them back to back actually is that's the great sequence. And I actually read Jared's first and followed it up with James's. And I could do it again the other way around and learn new and different things. So thank you for dedicating so much of your time for this discussion today. And thank you for joining us at the National Book Festival.
Thank you, all of you, for joining us virtually. I would like to have been with you in person, but this is the next best. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to attending the National Book Festival in person in the future.